Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. This is Matt Lynch. I'm a co-host of OnScript, along with Matt Bates, Drew Johnson, Aaron Heim, Chris Tilling, and Amy Brown Hughes. And we want to say thank you so much for listening, and especially to those of you who give regularly to make this show happen. Quick thanks as well to Ed Hackey for producing the show, Rebecca Terhune for helping with marketing and communications, along with Tommy Molman, and to James Steinbach for digging me out of holes when I try to quote-unquote fix things on the website. We hope you enjoy this episode with Dan Pioske. Hello, everyone, and welcome to OnScript. I am here today with Dan Pioske, who is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Georgia Southern University. He did his Ph.D. at Princeton Theological Seminary. He's the author of David's Jerusalem, Between Memory and History, and also he's the author of Memory in a Time of Prose, Studies in Epistemology, Hebrew Scribalism, and the Biblical Past, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. And we're going to be focusing a little bit more on that book, but we'll probably talk about his older book on David's Jerusalem and maybe touch on the book he's going to write next. So, Dan, thanks for taking the time to talk with OnScript.
Yeah, thank you, Matt, for having me. It's a privilege. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, well, great. Well, first of all, I just want to say that I really enjoyed reading your books, and I'm really impressed by the breadth of knowledge that you have in things historical, biblical, archaeological, and otherwise. So tell me a bit about your kind of interest in history as a kid. Yeah. This must have started before your PhD program.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in some sense, from a farm in the Midwest, up in Minnesota. And one thing you find if you drive around, this is of course in other parts of the world as well, are these old farmsteads, abandoned buildings, and a real sense of kind of even just immigrant communities too that are still kind of present in these rural communities where, you know, here's a German community, here's a Scandinavian community of some, and that ties to the past, and you wonder who or where you came from. And so I think there was a sense of history impressed upon me pretty early. And then when I went to college, I came to college in the early 2000s, and there's all these amazing debates going on around history. In the late 90s, early 2000s, you had, I don't like this terminology, I think it's kind of silly, but the maximalist and the minimalist debates were really kind of raging at that point in time, right when I hit college. And so I had this native interest in history, and coming to college at that precise time, I think just reinforced kind of some of these interests. So yeah.
Yeah, and so so you mentioned growing up in farm country in the Midwest. What state did you grow up in?
Minnesota, yeah.
Minnesota.
Yep.
Okay, so cold, frozen Minnesota.
Yeah, you got it. All correct.
And what kind of farming did you grow up on? A farm?
I did,
or
yeah.
in farming? Okay. What kind of farm?
Yeah, it was a family farm. They sold the animals in the early 1980s, so it was mostly crops. Okay. Green Giant mainly, so please buy Green Giant. It's a shameless plug for Green Giant. We grow for Green Giant to this day. I worked for them for a while. So yeah, in that kind of that farm.
What specific crops?
Peas and sweet corn.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not lima beans?
Not lima beans.
Okay, because that's my association with Green Giant is the corn and succotash. We call it in Pennsylvania. Do you call it that?
Yeah, I think we do. Yeah. That's
so nice. Lima beans and corn for those who don't know.
Where do they grow lima beans? This is a good question. In Minnesota we have like 3 months of the year where we can grow stuff.
Right.
And so you get in the
short,
ground.
intense growing seasons.
Yeah. You grow amazing things. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Great soil.
And then you gather around the hearth all winter and tell stories, and that's where the interest in prose came from.
There you go. I like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's
That's good. Well, so and do you come from a religious background? Was that where the Bible factored in all this?
If you're from Minnesota, you're born Lutheran, or at least culturally Lutheran, right?
Yes. You have to opt
many of us
out
are.
Of it
Yeah, exactly. There's a form you get.
In. Yeah.
And what's also pretty common. So my mom's Roman Catholic and my dad was Lutheran. And they made, after a great theological discerning, they decided that if the child was a boy, he'd be Lutheran girl Catholic.
Oh, really? You're serious?
I'm serious.
Okay.
I'm not so serious about the theological discernment. But so that's what I decided. So I ended up, being baptized Lutheran. But like I say, if you're from that part of the world, so much of your culture is kind of informed by Lutheran understanding still. And so that's kind of the framework. And even we can talk more about that perhaps with the books too. I think that's an overarching sensibility of thinking about the Bible and, going back in time. It's both Lutheran philosophers, theologians, biblical scholars who are kind of asking certain questions that I'm at an age now where you kind of take stock of your tradition in a particular way, right? And find yourself in that tradition. Whether you want to or not, you're part of a tradition, right? The good parts and the bad parts. Yeah.
And did you have an interest in the Bible as a youngster as well?
Yeah,
or?
I did.
Yeah,
I did,
okay.
yeah. And maybe it's part of that Lutheran heritage, right? But the Bible always just fascinated me. And there's something about, if you want to participate in political conversations, cultural conversations, even to this day, even in secular contexts, the Bible's still really important.
Yeah, it's still quoted on the campaign trail.
Exactly.
By most candidates, right?
Right. And I teach at a public university, and, it's non-confessional, but man, the Bible still really matters in all sorts of interesting ways. And so for me, just kind of as a locus of just kind of fascination. Yeah, in some ways inexplicable, I suppose, but in some ways very concrete and real.
Yeah, and I should say that the reason that Dan and I are talking about place and the Bible and history is because that's the kind of nexus.
Correct.
In
Yes.
your
Nice
books.
segue. I like that.
Yeah. So let's talk first about your book, David's Jerusalem, published by Routledge in 2015, and it's called David's Jerusalem: Between Memory and History. What was your main objective and thesis in that book? What were you arguing?
Yeah. So what am I arguing? I'm arguing. Or at the very least, I'm trying to think, what do we do as historians of the Bible, right? What is history when it's applied to biblical studies? So the first chapter kind of lays out some of the problems and possibilities of how we think about what history even is, theorizing history, right? Even the philosophy of history, and trying to take those conversations and bring them into our guild of biblical studies. And when doing so, and reading kind of the biblical stories about here now David's Jerusalem, realizing, or at least I make the argument, that what they're up to is something different than what I'm doing as a historian. And that to me is just really fascinating. What am I doing as I think about the past, and what were they doing as they thought about the past and told stories? And I found a pretty noticeable gap between those two things. So that's the memory and history kind of subtitle there.
And just on that point, you note that you have in at least some Greek historians, like Thucydides, an explicit reflection on the act of writing history. So that's kind of handy. But in the biblical material, you don't get those explicit reflections, right? So you have to deduce it. You have to
and
triangulate.
So, what are they doing when they're talking about the past, right? And again, this kind of comes out of the debates of the early 2000s, as biblical scholars are really kind of in these fierce arguments and conversations about the Bible and history. And, I think we are under a spell. We are enchanted in some way by this idea of history, right? And this gets into something of the second book as well, but, even in the first book, Yosef Yerushalmi, who's a Jewish historian, he really gets at this. He reflects on what he's doing as a Jewish historian and how it's a break with how Jewish individuals thought about the past before. And he really has this, it's a series of lectures, and in his last lecture, it's very kind of melancholic about how he thinks about what he's doing as a Jewish historian and what connections that has with, his community in the past. And you can really read it as a kind of...
Why is he melancholic?
Because he sees that what he is doing is something very different than what the rabbis used to do when they talked about the past, right? And he wonders, why is there this break? And what does it mean for him?
Why do we need to go... kind of be intentional and deliberate about a move to engage with the past as opposed to just it living in the tradition that we're part of?
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
And what does that mean for us? And so the between the memory and history bit, I think, plays into that. The David's Jerusalem part is, on the one hand, as you're thinking about a dissertation, you want to take something that's interesting and perhaps controversial, and Jerusalem during the time of David was that in the early 2000s, and still in some sense is. And so I wanted to, kind of address that. But what's also more important is the idea of place, as we mentioned earlier. the Bible is tricky when it comes to how we think about what they're doing historically, right? The texts are written and rewritten over a long period of time. But what do we think about the history of a place? Because places persist, they endure, right? In ways not true of other phenomena. And so doing a history of place, I think, allows us to make certain moves historically and think about, because, Jerusalem's been there both in the ancient world and our world. And we see it archaeologically, and the biblical authors are talking about it. And so a place lends itself to historical analysis in ways that I think are really fruitful.
Yeah, and that was one of the things I found really helpful in your both your books, really, is bringing place into the both theoretical and practical discussion of thinking about history writing. And just to put some flesh on that, I think... flesh, that wasn't the right metaphor for talking about place, but in any case, the land has a body.
Yeah, right.
So in the past, when people talk about, like, okay, how did, to take the question of your second book, what did biblical writers know about Iron Age Israel, and how did they know it? I think in the past, people talked primarily in terms of, how might oral tradition have been handed down? What were scribal practices in terms of the relationship between text and memory? And you're saying yes to that stuff, but also there's a glaring omission here. What do you? There's this gigantic mound of a prior city sitting there, and surely that would have been part of the way that people remembered stuff, or maybe not a prior city, an enduring city. So they've got there are land-based reasons why they, or means by which they're connected to the past.
Right.
So could you unpack that a little bit and explain how place factors?
Yeah, and so, I think one of the dangers of reading these ancient texts is to disembody them, to there's this kind of emphasis on text as text, and we read text in a various way, and we think about books, right? Because we are a product of hyperliteracy and wonderful things like that in the 20th and 21st centuries. But in the ancient world, texts, obviously function much differently. And so for me, it's trying to root these texts in an actual landscape, right? That's at least partially available to us via archaeology. And so I think we can actually spend some time in the landscapes of ancient Israel and Judah and ask the question, what were folks experiencing? What did they see? What did they touch? What did they feel? And then to read the biblical stories through that lens and to see what's being refracted, what's being obscured. I think it's just really fascinating because it allows us to get some insights into this question. The fancy word is epistemology, but what knowledge do they have about the past, and how do they get that knowledge? And I think one of the ways that they got the knowledge was not, I'm going to go to the library and check out 15 books and read about it. It was, I'm going to experience certain phenomena that are in the landscape, tangible objects.
And it wasn't just, I'm going to talk to the town storyteller, and ask that person what we know about the past, because you can go look at it. So just to jump ahead as well to the second book, I thought your analysis of Gath was very interesting. Sure. So biblical Gath, Tel Safi now, was a huge site in the ancient world. To give our listeners a sense of how prominent and there's been some really interesting news last summer even, so this is still very recent, where there might be Iron 1 evidence of a really massive city as well. So we think Iron Age 2A, so late 10th, 9th century, but now it may be that Gath was prominent even before then. So just a real quick, for reader or listeners that don't know this, Iron 2A is David Solomon kind of time period.
Yeah.
So
and Iron won't be just preceding that. So Saul and the Judges, so to speak, in the Bible. Anyway, so Gath is a prominent city at this point in time. And what's really important for the way I structured my book is that Gath gets destroyed pretty early on. And that's significant because if the biblical stories are not contemporaneous witnesses, and I don't think they are, and we can get into that in a second, they're written, a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations later, however we want to unpack that. If Gath does get destroyed early, and it's still appearing in these stories, then that's really interesting because
how do they know it?
How did they know it, right? And that gets into some of the memory bit as well. So Gath, though, is is really important. And a number of scholars have talked about Gath in this way. It's a really significant city, and then it gets destroyed early. And so if there's any memories of it in the Bible, those memories are likely early.
And so just to unpack the point about the stuff being written later, so you make the case that scribalism, the kind of infrastructure that you would need to write prose about the past, or write these stories such as we see in Samuel, that infrastructure wasn't there until 8th, 7th century. And so whereas Gath was destroyed in the 9th century under Hazael.
Yep.
So there's that gap there. So it provides a nice case study because there's a gap between when it was destroyed, when it was written down, when those stories were written down.
And I want to be precise about this point because I take a lot of heat for this. Knowledge of the alphabet is even Bronze Age, right? So the alphabet, we have inscriptions from the alphabet to Bronze Age.
The Hebrew, Proto-Hebrew alphabet. Yeah,
exactly, right? So the point, they had the technology, and I don't dispute the fact that they could have written prose stories down earlier, right? But you need a lot of factors to come in play to write prose down, because writing prose, and by prose I mean narrative storytelling, right? Not poetry. To write prose down is actually a pretty late phenomenon across cultures, not just in ancient Israel, but elsewhere as well. And so for me, prose, I think of it as a 9th century phenomenon at the earliest, right? As I make an argument in my book based on inscriptions and some other external factors. And so it's going to really come into its own in the 8th, 7th centuries, as you say. And that's great. It's a great case study then, because Gath is destroyed earlier. Yeah. And so how does it appear in these later stories?
Yeah. And part of what I like what you did with Gath is that you make the point that here you have this huge destroyed city.
Yeah.
So 120 acres, something like that, 125.
We always use dunams, of course, and hectares.
Dunams, hectares. Yeah, right. Okay, so it's
but
big.
Yeah, you're right. You're in the ballpark.
And perhaps the biggest city in the Levant, in southern Levant, during the time of David Solomon. So it's no small player, and it's right down the road from Jerusalem. So they're staring at this thing practically up the Elah Valley toward Jerusalem. So it's unavoidable. And how does it carry memories of the past? Like how is that transmitted?
So this is the question, right? Why do we find we shouldn't find references to Gath in the Bible, but we do.
Why shouldn't we?
Well, if we think that these texts are being written down as contemporaneous reports of what's happening in their own time period,
right. If they're only products of their time.
If they're only products of their time,
got it.
Then it should just be reflecting 8th, 7th century realities, right? Which is some argument scholars make from time to time in biblical studies, right? The texts only reflect the time that they're written. At moments, of course, is very true, and every text is going to reflect bits and pieces of the time it's written. But what I want to make a claim there is that with Gath, we have something that's earlier, and the question is, well, how is that the case? And lots of ways of thinking about that. But for me, and here again, I'm kind of using this word epistemology at the epistemological level, the level of knowledge. How do we account for this knowledge? I think memory is the best way of thinking about that. In other words, memories of Gath are being passed down. And it's likely because, as you mentioned, there's this big ruined city in the distance. And that city and its ruins are preserving memories in ways not true of other phenomena that are more fleeting or that do not endure. So memory and place are being connected there in a particular way.
Right, so it's triggering memories.
You got it.
And that's parallel to the way people are talking about the way texts are used as well. So texts, not in the sense of, I got to write this, there's a story I need to write down, but rather the text is there to aid memory so that you can tell it orally. And in a similar way, the tell of Gath is there to, and it functionally aids the memory as people are passing down stories. So people are probably familiar with Goliath of Gath, but just remind us of some of the ways that Gath shows up in the biblical stories to give us a sense of its prominence.
Yeah, so I mean, it shows up most prominently in the Samuel narratives dealing with David. Of course, Goliath is a main figure there in 1 Samuel 17. But later on, we really find these interesting stories where David flees from Saul in 1 Samuel 21 and later 1 Samuel 27 and goes to the city of Gath.
Yeah, what's he doing?
What's he doing there? Like, he's gone a whole bunch of different directions, right? But he goes to Gath.
Trying to reconcile with Goliath's family?
Yeah, exactly, right? Yeah, okay. He's making amends. David's not that type of person to make amends usually, though. So, so David's going to these places, and there's a really intimate connection between David and Gath. And then later on, we find that a number of mercenaries, or however you want to identify these individuals, are named Gittites. They're from Gath, who are evidently living in Jerusalem with David. These are his kind of fighters that have been alongside of him. And during Absalom's coup, David's outnumbered, outflanked, but he has his old grizzled veterans from his previous days, and a lot of them happen to be Gittites.
Yeah.
And so once
Gittite
again,
is from Gath.
Yeah, from Gath. Yeah. Thank you. Individuals from Gath. And so you have these very strange stories where Gath is playing an inordinate role in David's life, and I think fascinating ways.
Yeah. Now, one way of reading that is that the Bible's embarrassed about that and wants to suppress it. Okay. But you suggested something a bit more nuanced about the relationship between Gath and Israel. So Gath is a Philistine city. We tend to, if you refract everything through the David and Goliath episode, you think it's pure hostility. Of course, those stories are going to be embarrassing because it's supposed to be hostility. But what's your...
Yeah, so I think that, if you read closely, yes, there's certainly animosity between Philistine populations from Gath and biblical stories. I don't want to deny that. But if you read, there's actually a lot of interesting interactions between populations that are identified by biblical authors as Philistines and as Judahites or Israelites, that they're living alongside one another, that they're interacting even in times peacefully. They're working together at moments. And so you can even look at the Samson narratives, right? Of course, the David material, even in Genesis, where Abimelech's lands are quote unquote Philistine, and Abraham and Sarah are hanging out there, right? So you have these other stories where it's not always violent and warlike, and I think that's also reflected in the material culture, where you find a lot of interactions between these populations, which to me suggests that borders are much more fluid, identities are much more fluid, and we have to be very careful not to impose our modern constructs of both identity, ethnic identity, and political borders onto these texts, because they didn't exist then, right? And I think that also kind of helps us see some of these stories in a different light.
Yeah, and do you think some people theorize that part of the reason David's there is to get some of the iron technology from the Philistines? Do you put any stock in
No, you actually find more iron smelting technology in the highlands than you do in the lowlands.
Okay, so probably not.
I mean, the lowland areas of the Philistines have a lot of wealth. I think they're wealthier than highland populations, right? But technology, I don't know. There's that one reference in 1 Samuel, of course, that the Philistines were able to have iron technology. But I think, no, I don't put a lot of stock in that. Yeah. Okay. In short.
Yeah. Well, I mean, on the interaction point that you were making earlier, I mentioned to you earlier that I did a week-long dig at Tel Bernah, which is only a few kilometers from Gath, and you can see it from there. And it was just so striking to me that when I looked across the valley to Gath, that of course Israelites and Philistines are going to be grazing their sheep and cattle in the same areas and have lots of interaction that must have been peaceful, amicable. And so if you just read it through the lens of the wars, and I think the Bible even offers more than that, but we tend to read it through the lens of just the big battles, right. And then you
miss some other things if you do that, right?
Yeah, quite a bit. So I just want to switch gears here to do a speed round if you're up for that.
Yeah, man, let's do it.
So the idea is just a short, 5-second answer.
Okay.
Not reflective.
No reflection. Good to know.
The most significant find in archaeology in the last 10 years.
Last 10 years. All right.
That in the kind of carries significance for our reading of the Bible.
Okay. Wow.
Or in that world, biblical world.
Oh, that's a good one, Matt. Shoot, I'm trying to think in a good 5-second clip. Naturally I go to Gath and think about all of the excavations that have been and the size of Gath and so on and so forth.
It can be a structure.
Yeah, right. I mean, the temptation is always go to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is, of course, fraught with controversy, to say the least.
Okay, what's one from there then? Last 10 years.
In the last 10 years, Eilat Mazar has made the claim that she has uncovered David's palace. This is, I think problematic in some ways, in many ways, of correlating the Bible with archaeology immediately. But looks like something's there, right? Early Iron Age, structures are there. And for me, Jerusalem existed during this period in time. It was not just a figment of our imagination. It's not a Camelot sort of thing where it's just completely made up, right?
Yeah.
There's
ding, ding, ding. All right.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. How do you solve a problem like Maria?
How do you solve a problem like Maria? Get rid of the Nazis.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's always good. So this is a new question. We're here at SBL-AER, the annual meeting here in San Diego, and we're in the book hall where there's tons of books around us. Yeah. And I chose 2 books at random.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if
scared,
you could give them an endorsement. So
Yeah.
I'm not going to tell you anything about them except the title.
Okay.
And I want to just hear a little endorsement.
Okay.
Okay. Romans Disarmed.
Romans Disarmed. One of the Romans Disarmed. A seductive tale of allure of Paul's journeys abroad and his desire to go to Rome.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, the next title is Not Scattered or Confused.
The exact opposite of all graduate students here.
Okay, well, that's good.
Yeah.
All right, good endorsements.
Thanks.
Have you had a chance to wander the book hall yet?
Just briefly, yeah.
Okay, what are some books that you think we should watch out for?
That's good. There's, of course, I'm going to give you some non-biblical answers. But Paul Cosman's History of Time in a Seleucid Empire with Harvard University Press, I think, is a really exciting book that's, I think it was out last year, in fact, and it caught my eye briefly. What are some other books? Bill Schneidewin's book on The Finger of the Scribe just came out with Oxford University Press. I'm excited to read that. I've not yet read it, but it looks really good. So those are 2 quick answers.
Excellent. What's the most significant book in biblical studies in the last 50 years?
Oh, Matt, that's a good one. Off the cuff, I have to go with Frank Moore Cross, Canaanite Myth and Hebrew Epic.
Yeah.
But Alter's biblical narrative is a close second for me.
Yeah. Okay. Have you ever brought Tupperware to an SBL reception?
No, but I am going to steal that idea. Thank you for giving it to me.
Oh, there are a lot of receptions here at SBL with good food, and just as an idea. I don't endorse it, but it's an option. Okay, this is a joke.
Good. Thanks for letting me know ahead of time.
What happens if you boil a funny bone?
What happens, Matt?
It becomes laughing stock.
Nice.
That's humorous.
Yeah, you got that one on the plane over, didn't you?
I don't know. I got it from my wife, actually.
Nice, good for you.
Okay. Do you have a favorite joke that you want to tell?
Matt, I'm from the upper climes of the Midwest, where
you don't have time to joke.
Where you stare into the fire, into the hearth, and you try to last for 9 months in the wintertime.
Yeah. That's not a joke, is it?
No, that's not a joke.
Yeah. People are freezing to death.
Yeah, thank you. So no, I don't have a good joke at the top of my head.
Okay, that's fine.
I really let you know with that one.
Style of music and artists I would find on your playlist?
Yeah. I like indie.
Yeah.
Lana Del Rey, Grizzly Bear.
Okay.
Bon Iver. But I also like, I'll give you the classical answers because I want to be sophisticated, of course, right?
You don't have to be.
And I come out with Lutheran tradition, so of course, it's Bach and, a lot of those great kind of Lutheran composers that, where you kind of feel that tradition.
Yeah, Bach was, I think, one of Minnesota's best
composers.
One of
them, little known, right? Along with Prince and Bob Dylan, Bach.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
One of the cities that you talk about as well is Ziklag, where David goes down to in Fane's.
Achish gives him this. Who's the king of Gath? Gives him this town.
Yeah, so it's interesting because the next person I'm going to interview is Cynthia Schaefer Elliott, and she's done excavations at Tel Halif.
Yeah, right.
And which is one candidate for Ziklag, but you opt for Tel Sarah, right?
Yeah, I do.
Sarah.
And I do it in a very messy, sort of non-committal way because it's really hard. So for me, it's more important that these stories are rooting David somewhere in this area of Tel Sarah, Tel Halif, right? I'm not going to stake my scholarly career on one location. But the fact that these memories, if you will, are locating David there is fascinating because after that period in time, you're not going to find a lot of Philistine presence in these areas, or quote-unquote Philistine material culture in these.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's one more piece of this idea that
it fits in the Gath
there are
material,
some memories of the Iron Age that are being preserved.
Yeah.
Now, you also talk about things forgotten.
Yes, right.
So
a key component of this.
There's and you point this out, there's a classic maxim that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Yeah, right, old archaeological maxim.
But then you devote a whole chapter to absence of evidence.
Precisely that, yeah.
And you're saying there are a number of sites that were prominent in the Iron Age. They're not just sort of minor little off the road sites. These are major sites destroyed prior to Scribalism in Israel and apparently not remembered. Why is some stuff remembered and some stuff forgotten?
Yeah, right. So this is really...
I mean, it's almost impossible to answer, but I'd like to hear you reflect on that.
So I think this is really important for my project. What I'm not trying to do is this move where I'm going to find early material and beat back all the people who think that the Bible is not historical, right? That's not my interest. I have no interest in that. I'm interested in a spectrum of a dynamic kind of character of memory where some things I think are preserved. And I think some things get, I have a chapter on integral memory where you find... with the Ziklag stuff as well, some memories get reappropriated over time, and you get a mixture of things, so to speak. And then you find phenomena that I think are forgotten, like Kibbutz Haifa, Tel Kasil, Tel Rahov, a number of really important sites.
You got all those listeners?
Yeah, exactly, right. That are prominent early Iron Age sites that it doesn't seem that the Bible is referring to any of these sites. And they're contemporaneous with Saul and David and so on and so forth. And if you're walking around that time period, you would be mentioning these sites, I think. They're really important. And so the question is, why is no reference to these sites, right? Why are they, my language, forgotten? I think they were destroyed early. And because they were destroyed early, before prose writing really develops, and because it's not like Gath, which is, I think, attached to David in particular ways and has a connection with Jerusalem, because of the geography of these sites and because they're destroyed early on, we don't find them in the Bible, which tells me that these biblical stories are being written down a little bit later in time and that some of the memories, so to speak, are being forgotten in those generations.
Yeah. So, and then from the point of view of composing history about, composing these stories about a time in the past. So you put a lot of stock then in the way that the land would have been maybe even a more determinant factor in preserving memories than, say, oral traditions? Or how would you kind of rank those two in relation to each other?
Sure. Well, I think oral traditions are...
I don't know if ranking's the right question, but just the...
No, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, I think oral traditions are playing off of the physical phenomena that folks are seeing, right? I mean, the question is, in a world in which there are no books, in a world in which you can't walk into museums, how do you experience the past? How do you know the past, right? And for me, I think the one place we have to turn to are these places, because the places hold the ruins of certain locations, right? And sometimes towns are built atop the ruins, right? And so there you have a tangible kind of connection with the past. So for me, if we want to understand how the biblical authors are talking about the past and ancient Israel, these places are really, really important and lend themselves to thinking about this in creative ways and disassociating ourselves from modern kind of ideas of book culture. And so oral tradition still plays in that, right? But oral tradition is going to be interacting with these places, and I think being strengthened and buttressed by these locations.
Yeah, back to the idea of land-assisted oral tradition, right?
Yeah, nice. I like that.
So I'm trying to think, though. You've got Gath that's remembered, although it was destroyed early, but other sites forgotten, and they were destroyed early. Is it just that Gath was staring you in the face? It's so hard to avoid, but yet you remember Ziklag? Like, is there a bit of just ambiguity there?
Yeah, I think there's some ambiguity there. I think that's absolutely right.
I mean, that goes without saying, right?
That goes without saying.
But how do you balance those two things?
I think they're connected with David.
Yeah.
That's my short answer.
Okay.
Whereas other locations are not. And so, right, so we have these kind of core traditions about David, and he's at certain locations, and these locations, right, still can be experienced in certain ways.
Right. So you're walking by the Tell with your kids, and you're like, hey, kids.
Right.
David slept here. Right?
There's a fascinating passage in Nehemiah, just on a tangent. I think it's Nehemiah 12, where it says, and we were walking by, when we walked by the house of David, right? As we're walking along the walls in Nehemiah. And it's like, well, wait a second, a house of David would have been like 700 years old at this point in time.
That's
right?
fascinating.
I don't know what they saw, but they think they're claiming that they're walking by a house of David, right?
Wow.
So your point is actually well taken.
That.
That maybe they actually were going by these things.
And you point out in your book, too, that there's a tradition preserved in Deuteronomy and Joshua of setting up things so that future generations can ask about them, and then you can tell your kids, and that's how things are passed on. So the physical being a memory aid is baked into the Bible itself.
Right, it's really important for the biblical authors. So
Yeah.
the question is, what did they see, and what are they experiencing?
So you've put a lot of time into a kind of history of the role of place in history. Where are you going with your next project?
So I'm working on a book on ruins right now. And they're taking up some of the questions that the first two books are also thinking about. But, it's driven by just one really simple question. And that question, I mentioned this to Matt earlier, is why did no one in ancient Israel excavate? Why didn't they dig beneath their feet and think about the material culture that they would find? Because they're very interested in the past. Obviously, the biblical writings are saturated with an interest and a fascination with the past. And yet no one ever digs beneath the ground. And we do. And the question is, why do we? And when did we start being interested in that question? And I think if we can answer that question, the question is, why do we dig and why didn't they dig? It's going to tell us a lot about ourselves, too. And for me, this is, the larger kind of project is wrestling with what are we doing when we think about the past? And that tends to be history. And what were the biblical authors doing when they thought about the past, which I don't think was history in the modern sense, obviously. And then how do we read these texts in light of this gap between the two? Right?
So when you say they weren't doing history in the modern sense, I know we've danced around this, but what are they doing there?
That's the question. The question.
Okay,
right?
so that's the
And so for me,
book.
this is where memory helps out, right? Because the biblical writers talk about memory. They say that what they're doing is remembering. So it's an indigenous category, right? I draw on Foucault and say, we can think of this like as an episteme, a body of knowledge that is present in the ancient world. And of course, we still remember today, but today, you have professional historians who think about these questions according to evidence and particular, scholarly practices that didn't exist in the ancient world. And we accord a lot of significance into those historical answers, right? And so for me, the question is, why do we do history in this way? And how do we read text in which that's not present? And, this is the question that's haunted biblical studies and theology for 200 years now, right? And I'm trying to come at it from a particular direction, right?
Now, another piece of that is that they have religious aims in remembering the past. Right. And so it's not just to recount the past, but it's so that we can know Yahweh
exactly,
now.
Right. Yeah.
So,
and history is by nature a secular discipline, right? Even Vonaranka, who is, was very devout in his own way, history is still a secular discipline, right? And so this is the hard part for biblical studies and theology. On the one hand, you have folks who come out of faith communities, right, obviously, who are studying these texts, but who are using historical critical methods that are obviously secular.
Yeah, we had an episode on that recently.
Yeah,
actually.
Nice, right? And I went to Princeton, and Bart looms large there, and I took a class in Bart's theology and in his commentary on Romans, right? This beautiful commentary on Romans, where Bart is basically trying to make Romans speak to us today, right? And he does use some historical critical stuff in moments, but it can be sporadic. And that's fascinating because I want to do that at times. My problem is I can't because I have all this history, right? And I just can't, I use a lot of philosopher Paul Ricoeur, and he talks about the long detour in his philosophy. And if you read Ricoeur, it's very hard at times because he makes a point, and 400 pages later, he finally gets to it, right? Because he's making these long detours. And the reason he does that is because he says you can't get from A to B in a straight line. There's too many obstacles, too many hurdles.
Yeah, we can't pretend that those hurdles
We can't pretend
aren't
that they're not there.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying Bart's pretending. Bart's so sophisticated, and he's a genius. But for me, at least, I have all these hurdles, and those hurdles are constructed in the historicism of the 19th and 20th centuries. And I'm a product of that. I lived during this time. I can't ignore that. And for me, I'm trying to find my way, so to speak, right? as one who is late born, right? One who's a product of late modernity. And I don't know the answer to it.
Yeah, well, all the best to you as you pursue that
answer
to that question in your third book. So, Dan, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with OnScript. It's been a lot of fun.
Hey, I appreciate it, Matt.
Thanks.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.